People always ask when I knew I had found my family, and they expect me to tell them it happened on the day I got married. They're always surprised when I smile and tell them it started with a paper cup of coffee that cost less than $5. The sound of gentle laughter drifted through the garden as the late afternoon sun painted everything in warm shades of gold. White flowers swayed in the summer breeze. Tiny strings of lights shimmered beneath the oak trees, and somewhere nearby a child giggled so brightly that it made several guests turn and smile without even realizing it. I stood with a microphone in one hand, my heart somehow calmer than it had been all morning, staring at dozens of familiar faces who had gathered to celebrate something I once believed would never belong to me. At the front row sat my parents, wiping away quiet tears. A few tables away, friends who had watched every awkward chapter of my life lifted their glasses with knowing smiles. But my eyes kept drifting back to the two people who had unknowingly rewritten my future long before either of us understood what was happening. Noah Brooks looked exactly the same as the morning I first met him, although I doubted anyone else would notice the tiny differences that meant everything to me. The cautious loneliness that had once lived behind his gentle smile had faded into something steadier, something warmer. There were still faint lines near his eyes, earned from years of balancing deadlines, sleepless nights, and the impossible task of raising a little boy alone. But now those lines deepened whenever he laughed instead of whenever he worried. Beside him sat Lucas, no longer the shy 6-year-old who had hidden behind his father's leg every time they walked into my coffee shop. His dress shirt was already untucked despite repeated attempts to keep it neat, and he swung his leg beneath his chair with endless energy while trying very hard to look serious for the wedding photos. Every few seconds he glanced up at Noah, then at me, wearing the satisfied expression of someone who believed he had personally organized the entire day. Maybe he had. If anyone deserved the credit, it was probably him. The guests waited quietly as I looked around the garden once more. There was something almost impossible about seeing everyone gathered together like this. Years ago, I had convinced myself that life was simply a collection of routines. Wake up before sunrise, unlock the cafe, grind coffee beans, memorize regular orders, smile politely, clean tables, repeat tomorrow. It seemed safe that way, predictable. I thought happiness belonged to people who were luckier, braver, or somehow better prepared than I was. Then one ordinary Tuesday morning refused to stay ordinary. Funny how life never announces itself before changing everything. It doesn't send invitations. It doesn't play dramatic music. It simply slips into your day wearing an ordinary face and waits to see if you'll notice. Looking back now, I realize destiny has terrible timing and an excellent sense of humor. Was it love at first sight? Someone called from the back, earning another wave of laughter. I laughed too, shaking my head. Not even close, I admitted. The first thing I noticed about Noah was that he looked exhausted. More laughter spread across the audience, including from Noah himself. He rubbed the back of his neck in embarrassed surrender before lifting his coffee mug toward me, as if conceding the point. He came into my cafe every morning at exactly 7:15. I continued. Always ordered the same drink. Always thanked me with the same polite smile. Always sat by the window for exactly 20 minutes before heading to work. I thought he was just another regular customer. I paused, letting the memory settle inside me. I had no idea he was quietly carrying an entire world on his shoulders. The breeze carried the faint scent of fresh roses through the garden. Somewhere behind the reception area, someone adjusted the playlist, and a soft piano melody floated across the lawn. Lucas leaned forward in his chair, completely invested despite already knowing every version of the story. I smiled when I caught him mouthing the next sentence before I could say it. The funniest part, I said, is that none of this would have happened if Noah hadn't forgotten his wallet. More. Laughter followed. Noah covered his face with one hand while Lucas burst into delighted giggles. Seriously, I continued, that's the whole beginning. No grand romantic gesture. No movie moment. No fireworks. Just one tired dad standing at the counter realizing he couldn't pay for his coffee. My fingers tightened gently around the microphone as the memory became clearer than the celebration around me. I could still hear the grinder humming behind the counter. I could still smell cinnamon pastries fresh from the oven. I could still see sunlight spilling through the front windows of the little neighborhood cafe where my entire life quietly changed direction before I even knew it. If someone had walked in that morning and told me the quiet stranger I offered a free cup of coffee would someday become my husband, I would have laughed harder than anyone else. Because back then, he wasn't the love of my life. He wasn't even my friend. He was simply the tired single father who walked through my cafe door one perfectly ordinary morning, and neither of us had the slightest idea that we were about to become each other's greatest surprise. The applause faded behind me as the memory pulled me backward, away from the wedding garden and into a cool Tuesday morning almost 2 years earlier. My alarm had gone off at 4:30, just like every weekday. By 5:15, I had already unlocked the front door of Maple and Bean Cafe, switched on the warm hanging lights, and started grinding fresh coffee beans while the first batch of blueberry muffins baked in the oven. The neighborhood was still quiet at that hour. A few dog walkers passed the front window, delivery trucks rumbled through the intersection, and the sky slowly shifted from deep blue to pale gold. I liked those moments before customers arrived because the cafe belonged only to me. There was something comforting about wiping spotless tables, arranging fresh flowers near the register, and hearing soft jazz fill the empty room before the rush began. At 7 exactly, the first regulars appeared. Mrs. Henderson ordered her vanilla latte before walking across the street to the bookstore. Officer Daniels stopped by for a large black coffee and always reminded me not to work too hard. By 7:10, every table near the window had someone reading emails or newspapers. It was an ordinary morning, almost identical to hundreds before it, until the front door opened again at exactly 7:15. A tall man stepped inside, wearing a navy button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled neatly to his elbows. His dark blonde hair looked as though he had tried to fix it in a hurry before leaving home, and faint shadows beneath his blue eyes suggested sleep had not visited him for very long. He carried himself with quiet confidence, yet there was an unmistakable heaviness in his expression, as though every new day required more energy than he had left to give. He waited patiently while I finished another order, then offered a polite smile when it was finally his turn. "Good morning," he said. His voice was calm, warm, and just a little tired. "Large dark roast, please. No cream. No sugar." I smiled back. Coming right up. While the coffee brewed, I noticed he never looked at his phone the way most customers did. Instead, he stood watching the rain-speckled sidewalk outside with the distant expression of someone mentally organizing the next 12 hours before they had even begun. When I placed the cup on the counter, he reached into his jacket pocket, then another pocket, then his pants pocket. His calm expression disappeared almost instantly. He checked again, slower this time, before letting out the smallest sigh I had ever heard. "I am so sorry," he said, clearly embarrassed. I left my wallet on the kitchen counter. For a second, he looked as though he was debating whether to apologize again or simply leave without the coffee. I could see how uncomfortable the situation made him. Pride was not making him defensive. It was making him quietly disappointed in himself. I slid the cup toward him with an easy smile. "It is all right. This one is on me." He blinked in surprise. "No, I cannot let you do that." "You can," I answered. "You come back tomorrow and pay for 2 if it makes you feel better." He hesitated, still unsure. "I really do not want to take advantage of your kindness." "You are not." I shrugged lightly. Everyone forgets something once in a while. For the first time, the careful mask of responsibility slipped just enough for genuine gratitude to appear. It completely transformed his face. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You have no idea how much I needed this today. Hopefully it helps." I think it already has. He picked up the cup, nodded once more, and chose the window seat near the bookshelf. I expected that to be the end of our interaction, but every few minutes I caught myself glancing toward him while cleaning the espresso machine or serving customers. He never rushed through his drink. Instead, he wrapped both hands around the paper cup as though the warmth itself offered a few peaceful minutes before the demands of the day caught up with him again. At exactly 7:35 he stood, carried the empty cup back to the counter instead of leaving it on the table, thanked me one more time, and walked out into the brightening morning. The cafe became busy again, and before long I had nearly forgotten about the encounter. Nearly. Around closing time, I found myself wondering whether he would actually come back the next morning or whether that simple exchange had been nothing more than one brief moment between strangers. I laughed at myself while locking the front door that evening. Why should I care? Customers came and went every day. Some stayed for years, others disappeared after a single visit. That was simply how working in a neighborhood cafe went. Still, before leaving, I caught myself straightening the chair by the window where he had been sitting, even though it was already perfectly aligned with the table. I shook my head, switched off the lights, and stepped outside into the cool evening air. Somewhere across town, I imagined the tired stranger had probably finished another long workday and returned home to whatever life was waiting behind his front door. I could not have guessed that his life included someone very important whom I was about to meet, or that the following morning would quietly begin changing both of our routines in ways neither of us could possibly imagine. The next morning, I was wiping down the espresso machine when the little bell above the front door chimed at exactly 7:15 again. I looked up almost without thinking. Noah stepped inside wearing another neatly pressed shirt, although this time his tie hung loosely around his neck, as though he had tied it while walking out the door. The tired look was still there, but when our eyes met, the corners of his mouth lifted into a genuine smile that seemed much easier than the day before. Before I could even greet him, he placed a $5 bill on the counter. "I owe you for yesterday," he said. "And for today." I laughed softly while ringing up his order. "I told you that was optional. Not for me." He glanced toward the pastry display. "My father always said that kindness deserves to be remembered, not just appreciated." "He sounds wise." Noah nodded thoughtfully. There was a brief silence that felt comfortable instead of awkward. I handed him his coffee, and this time he stayed at the counter for another second before speaking again. "By the way, I never introduced myself. I am Noah." "Ethan." He repeated my name once, quietly enough that it sounded more like he was making sure he would remember it than simply acknowledging it. "Thank you again, Ethan." He walked toward the same window table, opened a leather notebook instead of a laptop, and began reviewing what looked like architectural sketches. Every few minutes, he made notes with a mechanical pencil before pausing to stare outside, as though searching for answers somewhere beyond the passing traffic. Over the next week, our conversations slowly became part of the morning routine. They were never long, usually no more than 30 seconds while I prepared his coffee, but each one added another small piece to the picture I had begun forming in my mind. I learned that he worked for an architecture firm downtown. I learned he preferred rainy mornings because they made the city feel quieter. I learned he almost never took lunch breaks, even though I gently reminded him that skipping meals was a terrible habit. In return, he learned that I baked the blueberry muffins myself, that I secretly believed cinnamon belonged in almost every pastry, and that I had lived in the neighborhood since college because I love places where people still greeted each other by name. Neither of us asked personal questions. Neither of us crossed invisible boundaries. We were simply two familiar faces sharing the beginning of each weekday. Then Friday arrived, and everything shifted in the smallest possible way. The front door opened several minutes later than usual, and Noah stepped inside, looking noticeably flustered. He was carrying a bright blue backpack over one shoulder while balancing a small hand inside his own. The little boy beside him looked around the cafe with enormous curious eyes that seemed determined to notice absolutely everything. Thick brown hair refused to stay neatly combed, freckles dotted his nose, and his sneakers flashed green lights every time he took another step. He stopped just inside the doorway, tilted his head upward, and whispered loudly enough for half the cafe to hear. "Daddy, it smells like cookies in here." Noah smiled with the kind of patience that only came from hearing the same observation delivered with complete wonder. "That is because they are baking the morning pastries." The little boy looked delighted by this explanation. When they reached the counter, Noah sighed apologetically. School delayed opening because of a maintenance issue, he explained. I have someone picking him up in 20 minutes, but I thought we would wait here instead of sitting in the car. You're more than welcome to stay, I replied. My attention shifted toward the child. Would you like a chocolate chip muffin? The boy immediately looked at Noah instead of answering, waiting for permission. Noah nodded. You may say yes. Yes, please. The little voice answered with remarkable seriousness. I placed the warm muffin on a small plate instead of handing it over in a paper bag. Careful. It just came out of the oven. Thank you. He climbed onto a chair near the counter while Noah paid for breakfast. A few moments later, curiosity overcame caution. Are you the coffee guy? He asked. I smiled. I suppose I am. Daddy says you make the best coffee. Noah looked mildly embarrassed. Lucas. What? The boy asked innocently. You do. I cannot help laughing. That might be the nicest compliment I have received all week. Lucas grinned proudly before taking another bite of his muffin, managing to leave a tiny crumb on the end of his nose without noticing. Noah reached over automatically and brushed it away with the practiced gentleness of someone who had repeated that exact motion hundreds of times before. It was such a simple moment that most people probably would not have remembered it. I did. There was no performance in the way Noah cared for his son. No dramatic speeches. No attempt to impress anyone. Every movement felt natural, quiet, and deeply familiar, shaped by years of early mornings, packed lunches, bedtime stories, and countless ordinary days spent putting someone else first. Watching them together, I finally understood the tiredness I had noticed since the day we met. It was not the exhaustion of someone chasing success. It was the exhaustion of someone carrying love as a full-time responsibility without ever complaining about its weight. Lucas finished his muffin, wandered toward the small bookshelf in the corner, and immediately became fascinated by a stack of picture books that local families often donated. He looked back at me with hopeful eyes. Can I read one? You absolutely can. Within minutes, he had settled into the oversized reading chair beneath the front window, completely absorbed in a story about a bear learning to ride a bicycle. Noah watched him for a moment before turning back toward me with a quiet smile that held both gratitude and relief. Thank you, he said softly. You have made this morning much easier than it could have been. I glanced toward Lucas, who was already laughing at something on the page. Honestly, I answered, I think he just made mine better too. Neither of us realized it then, but from that morning forward, it was no longer only Noah I found myself hoping would walk through the cafe door each day. I was beginning to look for the small blue backpack too. Monday mornings gradually developed a rhythm that none of us ever talked about. I unlocked the cafe before sunrise, started the first pot of dark roast, arranged the pastries inside the display case, and waited for the familiar sound of the little bell above the front door. Most mornings Noah arrived alone at exactly 7:15, carrying the quiet determination that seemed to define every part of his life. Every Friday, unless school schedules changed, Lucas came bouncing through the doorway beside him with enough excitement to brighten the entire room before he even spoke a word. Somewhere along the way, I stopped checking the clock because I could tell the time simply by hearing Noah greet me with a warm, "Good morning, Ethan." It surprised me how naturally those mornings settled into my life. There was never anything extraordinary about them. Noah ordered the same coffee every day. Lucas usually chose whichever muffin looked biggest, even though he rarely finished the whole thing. We talked about the weather, road construction, neighborhood events, and the never-ending challenge of convincing children that vegetables deserve a chance. Looking back, those conversations probably sounded completely ordinary to anyone sitting nearby, yet they slowly became the part of each morning I anticipated the most. One rainy Wednesday, the cafe stayed unusually quiet after the breakfast rush. Noah remained at his usual table near the window, surrounded by blueprints spread neatly across the wood surface. Every few minutes, he rubbed his forehead before making another note in the margin of a drawing. I carried a fresh refill of coffee to his table without being asked. "You look like you have been staring at those pages for hours," I said. He looked up with a tired smile. "It feels that way. Big project." He nodded slowly. "A community library renovation. The deadline moved forward by 2 weeks. That sounds stressful. It is. He wrapped both hands around the warm mug before continuing. But it matters. There are not many chances to design something that children might grow up remembering. That answer stayed with me because it told me something important about the man sitting across from me. He did not talk about awards, promotions, or impressive clients. He talked about children reading books in a building that had not even been completed yet. You really love your work? I observed. Noah smiled thoughtfully before glancing back toward the rain outside. Some days I do. Some days I simply do it because someone depends on me. I understood exactly who he meant without asking. There was a brief silence before I spoke again. Lucas seems like a wonderful kid. His entire expression softened in a way I had never seen before. It happened so naturally that I doubted he even realized it. It is the best part of every day, Noah answered quietly. Even when he leaves toy dinosaurs in my shoes or decides pancakes taste better shaped like planets. I laughed. That sounds very specific. It happened Sunday morning. Did you make planet-shaped pancakes? He sighed dramatically. For almost an hour. And he ate half of one before announcing that cereal sounded better. I laughed. So, another customer looked over to see what had happened. Noah laughed too, and for a moment the heavy responsibility I always sensed around him seemed to disappear completely. It was the easiest I had ever seen him. After the laughter faded, his eyes drifted toward the family photographs hanging on one wall of the cafe. Local customers often brought old neighborhood pictures that I framed as decorations. Can I ask you something? He said after a moment. Of course. Why did you open a neighborhood cafe instead of working somewhere bigger? I considered the question while wiping a few drops of coffee from the table. Because I realized I liked remembering people more than serving them. Big places move too fast. Here I know birthdays, favorite drinks, job interviews, anniversaries, retirement plans, and sometimes even the names of customers' dogs. It feels less like selling coffee and more like taking care of a tiny corner of the neighborhood. Noah looked around the cafe as though seeing it differently for the first time. That explains why it feels peaceful in here. Before I could answer, his phone vibrated on the table. He glanced at the screen, and the warmth that had filled his expression disappeared almost immediately. He answered the call with a calm voice. Hi, Mrs. Carter. He listened quietly for nearly a minute. I understand. Thank you for letting me know. I will leave the office now. He ended the call and released a slow breath. Everything all right? I asked. Lucas has a slight fever. His teacher thinks it is probably nothing serious, but he needs to be picked up. He immediately began gathering his papers, though I noticed the careful organization he had maintained all morning vanished beneath obvious concern. Blueprints were folded quickly instead of neatly. His notebook nearly slipped from his hands. Watching him, I realized something I had never fully understood before. Noah never stopped being a father. Even while sitting in a coffee shop discussing architecture, part of his attention always remained with his son. Every plan, every meeting, every deadline quietly revolved around a little boy waiting somewhere else. As he reached for his jacket, I said, I hope he feels better soon. Noah smiled gratefully. Thank you. He usually bounces back quickly. Then he paused, almost as though debating whether to continue. It is funny. There was a time when things like this terrified me. Because you were raising him alone? He looked at me for a long moment before nodding. The first year was the hardest. I kept wondering whether I was doing enough, whether I was making the right choices, whether one person could really be everything a child needed. His voice remained steady, but there was a quiet honesty beneath it that made every word feel genuine. Eventually, I stopped trying to be perfect, he continued. Now, I just try to be present. I watched him leave the cafe through the rain, walking quickly toward his car without thinking about the unfinished blueprints waiting on the table only moments before. For the rest of the afternoon, I found myself hoping Lucas's fever would disappear by bedtime. It surprised me how deeply I cared. A few months earlier, Noah had simply been another customer. Now, when the front door closed behind him, the cafe somehow felt just a little quieter than it had before. Lucas was back the following Monday, which immediately told me his fever had not lasted long. The moment the cafe door opened, He hurried inside with the unmistakable confidence of someone visiting a place that already felt familiar. Noah followed a few steps behind carrying his briefcase, laughing softly as he tried to remind his son not to run indoors. Lucas slowed to a careful walk, although the excitement on his face never disappeared. "Good morning, Ethan," he said proudly, as though greeting me had become an important responsibility. "Good morning, Lucas. You look much better." "I'm all better. Daddy said I had to rest all weekend." He lowered his voice dramatically. "It was very boring." Noah shook his head with an amused smile. He watched 3 nature documentaries and somehow still describes the weekend as boring. "Because I wanted to play outside," Lucas insisted before climbing onto his favorite chair near the bookshelf. I placed a warm chocolate chip muffin in front of him without asking. Noah noticed immediately. "You remembered." I shrugged with a smile. "He always picks the same one." Lucas looked unusually pleased that someone had remembered such a small detail. "It has the biggest chocolate chips," he explained very seriously. "That is an excellent reason." As the weeks passed, those little moments multiplied without any of us planning them. If Noah had an early meeting, I already had his coffee ready before he reached the counter. If Lucas came along on a Friday, I quietly saved the largest chocolate chip muffin before the morning rush could sell it. In return, Noah occasionally brought fresh flowers from the Saturday farmers market for the cafe, insisting they made the place feel even more welcoming. Lucas contributed in his own way by proudly presenting every drawing he completed at school. One afternoon, he handed me a picture colored almost entirely with blue crayons. "That is our coffee shop," he explained. I smiled at the paper before gently correcting him. "It is not my coffee shop." Lucas frowned. "But you're always here." "That part is true." "Then it is your coffee shop." Noah laughed softly from beside him. "I do not think you're going to win that argument." I carefully placed the drawing on the bulletin board behind a register where customers usually pinned community announcements. Lucas stared at it with wide eyes. "You really put it up?" "Of course I did. Even though it is not perfect, it is perfect because you made it." The smile that spread across his face could have brightened the entire neighborhood. From that day on, he checked every visit to make sure the drawing was still there. It remained exactly where he had first seen it. One quiet afternoon, after the lunch crowd had disappeared, Noah stayed longer than usual while Lucas sat reading another picture book beneath the front window. Outside, autumn leaves drifted gently across the sidewalk, covering parked cars in shades of amber and crimson. Noah watched his son for a long moment before speaking. "He talks about this place at home all the time." I looked up from polishing coffee mugs. "Hopefully that is a good thing." "It is." Noah smiled. "Apparently this is where the best muffins in the city are made." I cannot argue with such reliable research. He laughed before growing thoughtful again. "It is more than the muffins." I waited quietly. After everything changed in our lives, I worried he would stop feeling comfortable in new places. For a while he barely spoke to anyone outside school. His eyes followed Lucas as the little boy turned another page. Then we started coming here. There was gratitude in his voice, but also relief. He looks forward to Fridays now. I glanced toward Lucas, who had become completely absorbed in his story. I think he helped me just as much. Noah tilted his head slightly. "How?" I considered the question before answering honestly. Owning a neighborhood cafe means meeting hundreds of people, but most of those conversations last less than 2 minutes. Somewhere along the way, work can start feeling like repetition. Then Lucas walks through the door, asking whether squirrels celebrate birthdays or whether muffins taste better on rainy days, and suddenly the morning feels different. Noah smiled with quiet understanding. He has always been good at reminding people to notice little things. I think he learned that from someone. Noah looked away for a second, almost embarrassed by the compliment. "I'm still learning myself." There was another comfortable silence between us, the kind that no longer needed to be filled with conversation. The espresso machine hummed softly in the background while sunlight filtered through the front windows. A few customers came and went, but somehow the cafe still felt peaceful. Eventually, Lucas closed his book and walked over carrying it carefully against his chest. "Daddy." "Yes." "Can we come back tomorrow, too?" Noah smiled apologetically. "Tomorrow is Thursday. You have school." Lucas thought about that for a moment before turning toward me. Will you still be here on Friday? I laughed. Unless someone locks me out. Good, he said with complete satisfaction. Because I like when all three of us are here. The words were simple, spoken with the effortless honesty that only children possess, but they lingered in the air long after he finished speaking. Noah and I exchanged a brief glance before both smiling at the same time. Neither of us corrected him. Neither of us pointed out that we were simply a customer, a cafe owner, and a little boy sharing breakfast once a week. Somehow, without either of us noticing exactly when it had happened, Lucas had already started thinking of those mornings as something we belonged to together. And as I watched him happily slip his small hand into Noah's before they headed toward the door, I realized I had quietly begun looking forward to those moments just as much as he had. The first snow of the season arrived earlier than anyone expected. It was only a light dusting, barely enough to cover the sidewalks, but the entire neighborhood seemed to slow down as people bundled themselves into heavier coats and carried steaming cups through the chilly morning air. Inside the cafe, the windows fogged gently from the warmth, and the scent of cinnamon, coffee, and fresh bread made the room feel even more inviting than usual. I had just finished writing the daily specials on the chalkboard when the familiar bell above the door chimed. Noah stepped inside, brushing a few snowflakes from his shoulders. This time, he was alone. He smiled as always, but there was something distracted about him, as though his thoughts were somewhere else entirely. "Good morning," I said while preparing his usual coffee. "Good morning." His voice sounded softer than normal. "Everything all right?" He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Mostly. Lucas has a school field trip today. He was excited enough to wake me up before 5 o'clock. I laughed. That sounds like him. He packed his backpack 3 times yesterday just to make sure he did not forget anything. I placed the coffee on the counter. I hope he has a great day. Noah nodded gratefully. He will. I think I was more nervous than he was. He carried his coffee to the window table, but instead of opening his notebook immediately, he simply sat there looking outside as children wearing colorful winter jackets hurried past on their way to school. Even from behind the counter, I could tell his mind was somewhere far away. The morning rush came and went, and by 10 o'clock, only a handful of customers remained. Noah was still there, studying architectural drawings with the same concentration I had seen so many times before, but every few minutes his phone caught his attention. Around 10:30, it finally rang. He answered almost immediately. "Hello." I could not hear the other side of the conversation, but I watched the tension leave his shoulders little by little. "Thank you for calling," he said with an obvious sense of relief. "I appreciate it." He ended the call and let out a quiet breath before looking over at me with a smile. "Everything okay?" I asked while wiping down the espresso machine. "Lucas is having the time of his life," he replied. "Apparently he has already asked the museum guide 17 questions. I laughed. That sounds exactly right. Noah shook his head affectionately. His teacher said he wanted to know how every single exhibit was built. Future architect? Maybe. His smile lingered for another second before fading into thoughtful silence. Or maybe something completely different. I just want him to grow into whoever makes him happiest. That answer stayed with me long after the conversation ended. There was never any pressure in the way Noah spoke about his son. No list of expectations. No dreams that belonged more to a parent than to a child. Only the quiet hope that Lucas would one day find a life that brought him joy. Later that afternoon, just before I was preparing to close, the front door opened once again. This time Noah looked slightly flustered, and Lucas hurried inside wearing a bright knit hat that kept slipping over one eye. The little boy rushed straight to the counter, carrying a folded piece of paper. "Ethan," he said excitedly, "look what I made." He unfolded the paper carefully. It was a drawing of the museum, complete with enormous dinosaur skeletons, tiny stick figures, and what appeared to be an oversized gift shop that somehow occupied half the page. "This is amazing," I said honestly. "You even drew the snow outside." Lucas nodded proudly. "I wanted you to see it, because you said you liked drawings." Before I could answer, Noah quietly explained he insisted we stop here before going home. I smiled at Lucas. "I'm really glad you did." The The little boy studied the bulletin board behind the register where his earlier drawing still hung exactly where I had placed it weeks before. His face lit up. It is still there. I told you I was keeping it. He looked back at his father with obvious satisfaction, as though this somehow confirmed an important promise had been kept. Noah watched the exchange without saying anything, but I noticed the thoughtful expression that settled across his face. It was almost as though he was seeing something neither Lucas nor I could quite recognize yet. While Lucas wandered toward the bookshelf, Noah stepped closer to the counter. "Can I tell you something?" he asked quietly. Of course. After his mother passed away, Lucas stopped trusting that people would stay. My smile faded gently as I listened. Noah continued with calm honesty, never dramatic, never seeking sympathy. He became very careful about getting attached. Even relatives he loved would visit for a weekend and then leave again. For a while he started assuming everyone eventually disappeared. He glanced toward Lucas, who was happily turning pages in another picture book. Then we started coming here. I followed his gaze. "He never worries about whether you will be here," Noah said softly. "He simply believes you will." I felt an unexpected tightness in my chest. I had never imagined that something as ordinary as remembering a favorite muffin, saving a child's drawing, or greeting someone by name could carry that much meaning. "I have never thought of it that way," I admitted. Noah smiled. "That is probably why it matters so much. You're not trying to become important in his life. You're simply being yourself." Before I could find the right words, Lucas returned carrying his book. "Daddy," he announced, "can Ethan come see my school play next month?" Noah looked genuinely surprised by the question. "So was I," Lucas continued before either of us could answer. "I already told my teacher about him." Noah knelt beside his son with gentle patience. "Buddy, Ethan has work." Lucas frowned thoughtfully, then looked at me. "Do coffee shops ever close?" I laughed softly. "Sometimes. Then maybe you could come if it is one of those times." His hopeful smile made it impossible not to smile back. "If I can make it work, I would really like that." Lucas beamed as though I had already promised. As Noah thanked me and they prepared to leave, I watched the two of them disappear into the softly falling snow. And for the first time, I realized those mornings were no longer just part of my routine. Without noticing exactly when it had happened, they had quietly become part of my life. The invitation to Lucas's school play stayed tucked inside the pocket of my apron for nearly 3 weeks. Every morning before opening the cafe, I found myself checking that the folded sheet of bright blue construction paper was still there, as though it might somehow disappear if I looked away for too long. It was decorated with hand-drawn stars, uneven letters, and a smiling snowman, even though winter was already beginning to fade into spring. Across the top, Lucas had written, in large, careful handwriting, "Please come watch me." I had received plenty of invitations from regular customers over the years. Grand openings, retirement parties, charity events, birthday celebrations. I appreciated every one of them, but this felt different. This one had been offered with the complete confidence that I belonged there. The thought both warmed my heart and made me unexpectedly nervous. The afternoon of the play finally arrived on a Thursday. I closed the cafe an hour earlier than usual after asking my assistant manager to handle the final cleanup. As I drove toward the elementary school, I realized I could not remember the last time I had attended a school performance. The parking lot was already crowded with parents carrying flowers, grandparents balancing cameras, and younger siblings running excitedly across the sidewalks. I suddenly wondered whether I would seem out of place. Before I had the chance to overthink it, I spotted Noah standing near the entrance. He waved the moment he saw me, and the relief on his face suggested he had been quietly hoping I would actually come. "You made it," he said with a smile that seemed brighter than usual. "I told Lucas I would try. He has asked me at least twice every day this week whether you were really coming." I laughed softly. "That is a lot of pressure. You have no idea." We walked inside together, joining the stream of families making their way toward the auditorium. Folding chairs filled the room. Colorful artwork covered the walls, and children peeked through the stage curtains every few seconds, searching the audience for familiar faces. Suddenly, a tiny voice called from backstage. "Daddy!" Lucas stood in a handmade forest costume with felt leaves attached to his sleeves. The outfit looked slightly oversized, and his excitement was impossible to miss. The moment he noticed me beside Noah, his eyes grew even wider. "You came," he whispered, loudly enough for half the front row to hear. I said I would try. I knew you would. Before a teacher gently guided him back behind the curtain, Lucas gave me an enthusiastic wave that somehow erased every doubt I had about whether I belonged there. Noah watched his son disappear backstage before quietly saying, "Thank you." "For what?" "For showing up." We found our seats near the middle of the auditorium as the lights dimmed. The performance itself was wonderfully imperfect. Children occasionally forgot lines, someone dropped a cardboard tree, and one little girl waved continuously at her parents instead of paying attention to the story. Lucas delivered exactly 3 sentences during the entire play, but you would have thought he had performed on Broadway from the way Noah applauded. I found myself clapping just as proudly. There was something beautiful about watching a parent celebrate every tiny accomplishment with complete sincerity. After the curtain closed, families gathered in the hallway, while children proudly accepted hugs and congratulations. Lucas rushed toward us, nearly tripping over the edge of his costume. "Did you see me?" he asked before either of us could speak. "You were fantastic," I answered honestly. "You remembered every line." He looked incredibly pleased. "I practiced every night." Noah rested a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. "You worked very hard." Lucas looked between the two of us before smiling in quiet satisfaction. "I'm glad both of you were here." A few moments later, his teacher approached with a friendly smile. "You must be Ethan." I blinked in surprise. "I am. Lucas talks about you all the time." Noah laughed softly while I felt my face grow warm. The teacher continued, "Whenever we ask the class to write about people who make them feel safe, your name always ends up somewhere on the page." For a moment, I could not think of anything to say. Safe. Such a simple word. Yet somehow it carried more weight than any compliment I had ever received. Lucas looked up at me, completely unaware that his teacher had just shared something deeply meaningful. To him, it was simply the truth. As we walked outside into the cool evening air, the 3 of us moved naturally together without thinking about it. Lucas walked between us, happily swinging his small backpack while describing every funny mistake that had happened backstage. Noah listened with patient attention, occasionally asking another question that encouraged his son to keep talking. I realized I'd slowed my own pace without noticing, matching theirs as though we had walked this way countless times before. When we reached the parking lot, Lucas suddenly stopped. "Can we get hot chocolate?" he asked hopefully. Noah checked his watch with an apologetic smile. "It is a school night, buddy." Lucas accepted the answer without arguing, but I noticed the slight disappointment on his face. Before I had time to think about it, I smiled. "How about Saturday morning?" "My treat." Lucas's expression brightened instantly. "Really?" I looked toward Noah, silently leaving the decision to him. He smiled with quiet gratitude. "I think we can manage that." "Then it is a plan," I said. Lucas reached out without hesitation and slipped one small hand into Noah's and the other into mine as we crossed the final stretch of the parking lot together. The gesture lasted only a few seconds before he let go to chase a drifting blossom across the sidewalk. But in those few quiet steps, something inside me shifted. I glanced toward Noah at the exact moment he looked at me, and neither of us spoke. We did not need to. Some feelings arrive without grand declarations. They simply grow so naturally that one ordinary evening you realize your heart has already chosen a place it wants to stay, even while your mind is still trying to catch up. Saturday morning arrived wrapped in bright sunshine and the kind of crisp spring air that made the whole neighborhood feel freshly awake. I'd opened the cafe an hour later than usual because weekends moved at a gentler pace, giving families more time to linger over breakfast instead of rushing toward work. Fresh cinnamon rolls cooled behind the counter. Soft acoustic music drifted through the speakers, and the windows stood open just enough to let in the scent of blooming flowers from the sidewalk planters outside. I had barely finished arranging the pastry display when the familiar bell above the door rang. Lucas hurried inside first, wearing a baseball cap that sat slightly crooked on his head. Noah followed behind, carrying the relaxed smile of someone who did not have a schedule, chasing him for once. "Good morning," Lucas called before I even had a chance to speak. I remembered. I laughed. "So did I. You promised hot chocolate." "I did. And Daddy said promises are important." Noah smiled apologetically. "He has been reminding me about this since Thursday." "That sounds fair," I replied while pouring warm milk into a steaming pitcher. A few minutes later, we settled into the corner table beside the front window instead of staying behind the counter. It was one of the first times I had sat with them during business hours. My assistant manager handled the register while I enjoyed something that felt surprisingly unfamiliar, taking time to simply share breakfast instead of serving it. Lucas stirred whipped cream into his hot chocolate with complete concentration before announcing, "This is definitely better than the one at school." "High praise," I said. "Very high," Noah added with a grin. Conversation wandered easily from Lucas's science project to the baseball season, from favorite books to whether squirrels would make good cafe customers if they could pay for muffins. It was the kind of wonderfully ordinary morning that somehow passed much too quickly. After Lucas wandered toward the bookshelf to look for another picture book, Noah grew unexpectedly quiet. He watched his son for a long moment before speaking softly. "There is something I have been meaning to tell you." I looked at him with quiet curiosity. "What is it?" He rested both hands around his coffee mug before answering. "My company offered me a promotion." "That is wonderful." I meant it sincerely, but something about his expression told me there was more. He nodded slowly. "It is a very good opportunity." "Then why do you look worried?" Noah let out a slow breath. "Because the position is in Seattle." The words settled between us more heavily than either of us expected. I stared at him for a moment, unsure whether I had heard correctly. "Seattle." He nodded. "They want me to lead a new design team there. That is almost 3,000 miles away." "I know." Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The cheerful sounds of the cafe continued around us. Cups clinked against saucers. Someone laughed near the front counter, and outside a cyclist rolled slowly past the window. Everything looked exactly the same, yet suddenly nothing felt quite as steady as it had only moments before. "Have you decided?" I finally asked. Noah looked toward Lucas before answering. "Not yet. It sounds like an incredible opportunity. Professionally, yes." He smiled faintly. "Personally, it is more complicated." I understood immediately. Moving would mean a new city, a new school, a new routine, and asking one little boy to leave behind the places where he had finally begun feeling secure again. "Lucas does not know yet," Noah continued. "I wanted time to think before saying anything." I nodded quietly. "That makes sense." He studied the coffee in front of him without taking another sip. The strange thing is that a year ago, I would have accepted immediately. I would have told myself it was obviously the right decision. And now, he smiled with gentle honesty. Now I have to think about more than career opportunities. Before I could answer, Lucas returned carrying 2 picture books stacked in his arms. "Can I borrow these from the library later?" he asked Noah. "I think so." "Good." He looked at me. "You should read them too. I will add them to my list." Lucas smiled, completely unaware of the conversation he had interrupted. He climbed back into his chair and happily resumed telling us about the story he wanted to write for school. Noah listened carefully, asking questions and laughing at every imaginative detail. I watched the two of them together, and for the first time the thought of this table sitting empty on future Saturdays felt almost impossible to imagine. Later that afternoon, after they had left, I found myself glancing toward the front door every time it opened, almost expecting them to return because somehow the goodbye had felt unfinished. They did not. The cafe closed as usual, customers drifted home, chairs were stacked onto tables, and the lights dimmed one by one. Yet Noah's words stayed with me through every part of the evening. Seattle. The distance stretched across my thoughts like an endless highway. I tried convincing myself that it was none of my business. Noah had every right to choose what was best for his family. We had never defined whatever existed between us. We had never spoken aloud about the quiet affection that had grown over months of shared mornings and ordinary conversations. Even so, I could not ignore the ache that settled quietly inside my chest. On Monday morning, Noah arrived at exactly 7:15, just as he always did. He smiled, ordered his usual coffee, and thanked me with the same warm kindness that had become so familiar. To anyone watching, nothing had changed. But when our hands briefly brushed as I handed him his cup, we both hesitated for the smallest fraction of a second before letting go. Neither of us mentioned Seattle. Neither of us spoke about the uncertainty waiting just beyond the edges of our comfortable routine. Yet in the silence between us, I sensed we were both beginning to understand the same difficult truth. Sometimes you only realize how deeply someone has become woven into your everyday life when you're forced to imagine what those ordinary days would look like without them. Monday turned into Tuesday, and Tuesday quietly became Friday before either of us found the courage to mention Seattle again. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Noah still arrived at 7:15. I still had his coffee waiting before he reached the counter. Lucas still searched the pastry case for the largest chocolate chip muffin, even though he already knew which one I had quietly set aside for him. To anyone walking into the cafe, we looked exactly the same as we always had. Only we knew how much careful silence had settled between our familiar conversations. One quiet afternoon, just before closing, the bell above the door chimed again. I looked up expecting another customer, but instead found Noah standing alone. He was not carrying his briefcase. There was no notebook tucked beneath his arm. He simply stood there with both hands in his jacket pockets, wearing the thoughtful expression I had come to recognize whenever something important weighed on his mind. "We are closed in 15 minutes, I said with a small smile. "I was hoping you might still have time for one conversation." I nodded toward the window table. "I think I can make an exception." We sat across from each other as the last customer finished reading near the front window. Outside, the evening sunlight stretched long shadows across the sidewalk where everything had first begun. Noah wrapped both hands around the warm coffee cup I had placed in front of him, although he never took a sip. "They want my answer tomorrow," he said quietly. I nodded. "Have you decided?" He looked toward the empty chair beside us, the one where Lucas usually Saturday. I asked Lucas what he thought about moving. My heart tightened slightly. What did he say? Noah smiled with both affection and sadness. He asked whether the new city would have a coffee shop with Ethan. I could not help laughing softly, even as emotion caught in my throat. Noah continued. I told him every city has coffee shops. He shook his head with a faint smile. He looked at me and said, "That is not what I asked." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, Noah looked directly at me. Children have a way of asking the questions adults spend months trying to avoid. I looked down at my hands before answering honestly. I've been trying not to think about you leaving. I know, because I kept telling myself it was not my place. Noah leaned forward slightly. Then let me make it your place. My eyes met his again. Ethan, somewhere between that first cup of coffee and all the mornings that followed, you became part of our lives. His voice remained calm, but every word carried quiet certainty. Not because you tried to, not because you expected anything in return, simply because you kept showing up. I felt every carefully built wall inside me begin to soften. You did the same for me, I admitted. This cafe used to be my whole world. Then one morning a tired father walked through the door, and somehow the days started meaning more than opening and closing on time. Noah smiled gently. I was hoping you might say something like that. I laughed under my breath. You were. Eventually, he took a slow breath before continuing. I turned down the promotion this morning. I stared at him in surprise. You already decided? He nodded. The opportunity was wonderful. But somewhere along the way, I realized I had spent years trying to build beautiful places for strangers while the people I cared about most had quietly built a home around me. My eyes searched his face, still trying to understand. Are you sure? Completely. Before I could answer, the front door suddenly opened with familiar energy. Daddy. Lucas hurried inside, carrying a backpack almost as large as he was. Noah looked genuinely surprised. I thought Mrs. Carter was bringing you home. She did. Lucas pointed toward the parking lot. But I wanted to tell Ethan something. He walked straight over to me with complete confidence. Daddy says we are staying. He told you? Noah asked. Lucas nodded happily. He said home is more important. Then the little boy looked directly at me with the same simple honesty that had changed so many ordinary days. I knew we would stay because home is wherever the people you love are. The cafe became completely quiet. Noah looked at his son, then back at me. I think he understands life better than either of us. I smiled through eyes that suddenly felt warmer than usual. I think you might be right. Lucas frowned thoughtfully. Can I tell you something else? Always. He grinned. I already thought you were family. No speech I had ever heard could have carried more meaning than those 6 uncomplicated words. Noah closed his eyes for just a second before quietly laughing. Well, he said softly. I guess he said it before I could. He reached across the table. Not dramatically, not hurriedly, but with the same quiet certainty that had defined every meaningful moment between us. I reached back, and our hands met naturally, as though they had already known where they belonged. 1 year later, the applause in the wedding garden slowly faded as I looked from Noah to Lucas and back again. People still ask me what the greatest surprise of my life was. I said into the microphone with a smile. They think it was finding love when I least expected it. I shook my head gently. They're only half right. The greatest surprise was discovering that the smallest act of kindness could quietly grow into a family. I turned toward Noah, whose eyes had not left mine since the ceremony began. That morning, I thought I was simply giving a stranger a cup of coffee. I smiled as Lucas slipped his hands into both of ours exactly the way he had done so many months before. It turned out I was being handed the 2 people who would become my home. 1 year after our wedding, life settled into the kind of happiness that rarely makes headlines, but quietly changes everything. The alarm still rang before sunrise, and I still unlocked the front door of Maple and Bean Cafe while the streets were mostly empty. The difference was that I no longer walked into the silence alone. Some mornings Noah arrived carrying 2 travel mugs because he insisted architects could make coffee too, even if I gently reminded him that I had spent years perfecting the process. Other mornings, Lucas rushed through the doorway before either of us, announcing that he had already decided which muffin deserved the title of breakfast champion that day. The neighborhood noticed the changes long before we did. Mrs. Henderson started calling us the morning trio. Officer Daniels joked that our coffee shop should charge extra for the free smiles that came with every order. Families who had once stopped by only for a quick drink now stayed longer, filling the cafe with conversations, board games, and laughter that stretched well beyond breakfast. Without planning it, we had become exactly the kind of place I had always hoped to create, a place where people felt recognized the moment they stepped through the door. One Saturday afternoon, Noah spread several large architectural drawings across our dining table at home, while Lucas colored pictures beside him. I walked over carrying 3 mugs of hot chocolate and paused when I noticed the sketches. Working on another library? I asked. Noah smiled and shook his head. Not this time. He turned 1 page toward me. It was a detailed drawing of an expanded cafe with larger windows, a reading corner for children, a small community room, and an outdoor garden where customers could enjoy coffee beneath flowering trees. I stared at the plans in surprise. You designed this? I have been working on it for months. Why did you not tell me? He laughed softly. Because I wanted to make sure it was possible before I got your hopes up. Lucas looked up from his coloring book with complete confidence. I knew. I blinked. You knew. He nodded proudly. Daddy asked me where the bookshelf should go. Noah smiled with playful surrender. Apparently, I was not very good at keeping secrets. I studied the drawings again, noticing dozens of thoughtful details that reflected everything we had talked about over the years. There was space for local artists to display their work, comfortable reading chairs near the windows, wider aisles for strollers and wheelchairs, and even a small shelf labeled Community Puzzle, where neighbors could slowly complete a puzzle together over several weeks. You remembered everything, I said quietly. Noah reached for my hand. Because I listened. A few months later, after careful planning and plenty of hard work, the expanded cafe finally opened. The first morning felt strangely familiar despite everything looking new. Fresh flowers stood on every table, Sunlight poured through the larger windows, and children immediately claimed the reading corner as though it had always belonged there. Lucas proudly gave unofficial tours to every customer willing to listen, pointing out the bookshelf he had helped organize and the chalkboard where neighborhood children could leave encouraging messages. One little girl carefully wrote, "Be kind today," and by lunchtime someone had added, "Someone might need it." I smiled at those words because they reminded me how unexpectedly simple kindness could be. Late that afternoon, while the cafe buzzed with happy conversation, a young man stepped hesitantly through the front door. His shoulders looked tense, his eyes carried obvious exhaustion, and after waiting patiently in line, he quietly reached into his jacket before freezing with an embarrassed expression. I recognized that look immediately. He searched another pocket, then another, before letting out a small sigh. "I'm sorry," he said. "I think I left my wallet at home." For just a moment, I saw another morning from years before reflected in front of me. I smiled, slid the warm cup across the counter, and said the same words that had changed my own life without my ever realizing it. "It is all right. This one is on me." The young man looked genuinely surprised. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely." Before he could thank me again, Noah glanced up from helping another customer and smiled because he understood exactly why those words mattered. Across the room, Lucas watched the exchange with quiet curiosity before walking over to stand beside me. "Daddy," he whispered after the customer found a seat by the window. "Was that like when you first met Papa Ethan?" I looked at Noah, who laughed softly before answering. "It was very much like that." Lucas smiled with complete satisfaction. Then maybe somebody else's story just started too. His simple observation settled gently over all three of us. I rested a hand on his shoulder while Noah reached across the counter to squeeze my fingers for just a moment. Neither of us knew what the future held for the young man, sitting quietly by the window, and perhaps nothing extraordinary would happen at all. But we had learned that life rarely announced its biggest changes with grand gestures. Sometimes it arrived, disguised as an ordinary morning, an unexpected conversation, or a simple paper cup offered with genuine kindness. As I looked around the cafe filled with neighbors, friends, laughter, and the family I had once believed was only a distant dream, I realized the greatest blessings often begin so quietly that you only understand their true meaning after looking back. And every single morning after that, whenever someone thanked me for the coffee, I smiled because I knew that every once in a while, the smallest act of kindness could become the first page of someone's happiest chapter. By the time another spring arrived, Maple and Bean Cafe had become more than a neighborhood coffee shop. It had quietly grown into the kind of place where birthdays were celebrated around the corner table, where high school students studied for final exams beside retired teachers, and where strangers often walked in carrying the weight of difficult days only to leave a little lighter than when they had arrived. Noah liked to joke that the building had somehow learned everyone's name before he did, but I knew the truth was much simpler. People returned because someone remembered them. Someone remembered how they liked their coffee, asked how their interview had gone, celebrated when they received good news, and listened without rushing when life became unexpectedly difficult. One Friday afternoon, while I was arranging fresh flowers near the register, Lucas burst through the front door with more excitement than usual. His backpack bounced against his shoulders as he hurried toward the counter. "Papa Ethan," he announced proudly, "I got the part." I looked up with a smile. "The part in what?" "The school talent showcase." Noah followed a few steps behind, carrying the familiar expression of a father who had already heard the story 3 different times on the drive over. "He is going to read something he wrote himself," Noah explained. My eyes widened. "You wrote your own story?" Lucas nodded enthusiastically. "My teacher said it should be about someone who changed my life." He reached into his backpack and carefully pulled out several folded pages. "Can I read it to both of you?" "I would love that," I answered immediately. We closed the register for a few minutes while my assistant manager watched the front counter. Lucas climbed onto one of the reading chairs in the children's corner, cleared his throat with exaggerated seriousness, and began reading from the pages held carefully in both hands. His voice occasionally stumbled over longer words, but he never lost confidence. The story was about a little tree growing beside a busy sidewalk. Every day, people hurried past without noticing it, until one morning someone stopped long enough to water it. Soon another person sat beneath its branches to rest. Then children began reading books in its shade. Eventually the tree realized it had never grown because it wanted to become the tallest tree in town. It had grown so people could feel welcome whenever they needed a place to stay. When Lucas finished reading, the cafe had become surprisingly quiet. A few regular customers had stopped talking just to listen. Mrs. Henderson quietly dabbed at the corner of one eye with a napkin. Officer Daniels clapped first, and within seconds, the entire cafe joined him. Lucas looked both surprised and delighted by the applause. "That was beautiful," I said honestly. "Who inspired the story?" Lucas smiled as though the answer should have been obvious. "Both of you." Noah rested a gentle hand on his son's shoulder while I tried to find the right words. Lucas continued before either of us could speak. "Daddy always says buildings are important because they give people somewhere to belong. You always say coffee tastes better when people feel remembered. I thought maybe the tree was like both of those things." Noah looked at me with quiet amazement. I think he just explained our entire life in one story. I laughed softly. He definitely did it better than I ever could. Later that evening, after the last customer had gone home and the chairs were stacked neatly onto the tables, Noah and I sat together near the front window while Lucas finished a puzzle in the reading corner. The setting sun painted warm streaks of orange across the sidewalk where everything had first begun years earlier. "Do you ever think about that first morning?" Noah asked quietly. "More often than you probably realize." He smiled. "I almost walked away without the coffee. I almost insisted that you take it anyway." "You did insist." "That sounds like me." Noah laughed before growing thoughtful again. "I used to believe life changed because of enormous decisions. Accepting promotions, buying houses, moving across the country." He slowly shook his head. "Now, I think the biggest changes begin with moments that seem too ordinary to matter." I looked toward Lucas, who was carefully searching for one missing puzzle piece with complete determination. "I agree," I answered. If someone had asked me what the most important moment of my life would be, I never would have guessed it would happen while standing behind a coffee counter before 8 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. Noah reached across the table and gently took my hand. I'm glad neither of us knew. Why? Because if we had known how important that morning would become, we might have been too nervous to simply be ourselves. I smiled because I knew he was right. Kindness rarely announces itself as the beginning of something extraordinary. It simply asks for one small decision at a time. One cup of coffee, one remembered name, one invitation accepted, one conversation that lasts a little longer than expected. Across the room, Lucas suddenly held up the final puzzle piece with a triumphant grin. "Found it," he announced. He carefully pressed it into place, completing the picture of a lighthouse overlooking the ocean. "Look," he said proudly, carrying the finished puzzle over to us. "Everything fits now." Noah and I exchanged another quiet smile before looking back at Lucas. Neither of us said it aloud, but we were thinking the same thing. Life had never become perfect. There were still busy mornings, unexpected challenges, and ordinary worries waiting beyond tomorrow. Yet somehow, through patience, kindness, and countless small moments shared together, our lives had found their missing pieces too, fitting together so naturally that it was difficult to remember a time when they had ever been apart. Summer arrived with longer mornings and slower evenings, and the cafe seemed to breathe along with the neighborhood. The outdoor tables filled before 8 o'clock. Children rode bicycles past the front windows with melting ice cream cones in their hands, and the flower boxes Noah had designed beneath every window overflowed with bright colors that changed a little more each week. Sometimes I stood behind the counter during the busiest part of the morning and simply watched the room for a moment. Conversations blended with the gentle sound of coffee grinders. Pages turned quietly in the reading corner, and familiar faces greeted one another as though the cafe had always been part of their daily lives. It was no longer just a business. It had become a place where people carried both celebrations and worries, trusting that someone inside would remember them. One Saturday, The annual neighborhood summer festival transformed the entire downtown district into a lively gathering filled with local musicians, handmade crafts, and family activities stretching across several blocks. Maple and Bean Cafe sponsored a small reading tent where children could listen to stories while parents enjoyed coffee nearby. Noah had spent weeks designing the wooden display shelves for local authors, while Lucas insisted on helping decorate the tent with colorful paper stars that hung from every corner. By mid-morning, the festival was buzzing with laughter. Children sat cross-legged on picnic blankets, listening to volunteer readers. Teenagers performed acoustic songs near the fountain, and older couples wandered from booth to booth carrying fresh lemonade. I watched Lucas proudly hand out bookmarks he had helped create at school, greeting every child with the confidence of someone who genuinely loved making other people feel welcome. At one point, he hurried back toward me with a thoughtful expression. "Papa Ethan," he asked, "why do so many people smile when they come here?" I looked around before answering. Mrs. Henderson was introducing two new neighbors to Officer Daniels. A young mother thanked Noah for carrying her stroller across uneven pavement. 3 high school students were laughing over a board game borrowed from our community shelf. "I think," I said slowly, "people smile because they know they do not have to pretend here." Lucas tilted his head. "What do you mean?" Before I could answer, Noah joined us carrying a fresh tray of iced tea. He smiled at Lucas. "Sometimes people spend all day trying to be strong, successful, or impressive. It gets tiring." Lucas nodded thoughtfully. Noah continued, "When they come here, they can just be themselves." Lucas seemed to consider that for a long moment before smiling. "I like that better." "So do I admitted. Later that afternoon, the mayor stepped onto the small community stage to thank local volunteers who had helped organize the festival. To my complete surprise, he invited Noah and me to join him for a brief recognition. We exchanged confused glances before walking toward the stage together. "Communities are not built only with roads and buildings," the mayor said into the microphone. "They're built by people who quietly create places where everyone feels welcome." He looked toward us with a warm smile. Maple and Bean Cafe has become one of those places. The applause that followed felt almost overwhelming because it was never something either of us had worked toward. We simply wanted to make good coffee, remember names, and leave room for conversations that mattered. After the ceremony ended, we slipped away from the crowd as quickly as possible, both slightly embarrassed by the attention. Lucas, however, looked delighted. "You got a trophy," he announced, pointing to the small glass plaque Noah was carrying. "Technically, we got a plaque," Noah corrected gently. "It still counts," Lucas replied with absolute certainty. That evening, after the festival ended and the streets grew quiet again, the 3 of us carried folding chairs back inside the cafe. The room felt peaceful after a day filled with voices. Sunlight faded into soft amber across the polished wooden floor, while the last rays of daylight reflected through the front windows. Lucas climbed into his favorite reading chair with a book before sleepiness slowly overcame him. Within minutes he had drifted off, the open book resting gently across his lap. Noah looked at him with the familiar expression that always appeared whenever he watched his son sleeping. "He is growing up too fast," he said softly. "He is," I agreed. "But somehow he still gets excited about chocolate chip muffins." Noah laughed quietly. "Some things should never change." We sat together in comfortable silence for several moments before he spoke again. "Do you remember what you told me the first time I forgot my wallet?" I smiled immediately. "This one is on me." He nodded. "At the time I thought you were simply offering a cup of coffee." He looked around the cafe, then toward Lucas, still peacefully asleep nearby. "Now I realize you were offering something much bigger. You were offering grace without asking questions." I rested my hand over his. "You gave me the same thing," I answered. "You trusted me with your ordinary days. That was the greatest gift anyone has ever given me." Noah squeezed my hand gently before looking toward the quiet street outside, where twilight settled over the neighborhood that had brought all 3 of us together. "Funny," he said with a smile. "People spend their whole lives searching for extraordinary moments." I nodded. "And most of them are hidden inside completely ordinary mornings." We sat there until the evening lights reflected softly against the windows, listening to the peaceful rhythm of the cafe around us. In that quiet moment, surrounded by familiar tables, well-loved books, the scent of fresh coffee that never quite left the air, and the family that had been built one small kindness at a time, I understood that happiness was never something waiting far ahead in the future. It had been patiently growing around us all along, one ordinary day after another, until those ordinary days became the life we had once only hoped was possible. Years passed so quietly that we hardly noticed how many ordinary mornings had become treasured memories. Lucas was taller now, his once crooked baseball cap replaced by headphones that rested around his neck, although he still reached for the biggest chocolate chip muffin every Saturday without fail. Noah's architectural project had expanded across the state, but he never accepted a meeting that kept him from our Friday breakfast together. As for me, I still believed the first customer deserved the same warm welcome as the 100th, because I had learned long ago that you never knew which ordinary greeting might become someone's unforgettable beginning. Maple and Bean Cafe continued growing alongside the neighborhood. The children's reading corner was always occupied. The community bulletin board overflowed with announcements celebrating graduations, new babies, volunteer projects, and local concerts, and every December our customers filled the giving tree with gifts for families who needed a little extra kindness during the holidays. Looking around the room on any given afternoon, it became almost impossible to remember a time when the cafe had been only a place to buy coffee. It had become a collection of stories, each one beginning with two strangers deciding to treat each other with simple respect. One crisp autumn morning, while I was arranging fresh pastries behind the counter, Lucas walked in carrying a stack of college brochures beneath one arm. "Papa Ethan," called with the same cheerful voice that had once echoed through the cafe as a 6-year-old. "I need both of you." Noah looked up from the table where he had been reviewing blueprints. "That sounds serious." Lucas placed the brochures on the counter and smiled. "I finally decided." We exchanged a quick glance before giving him our full attention. "I want to study architecture," he said, "but I also want to design places where people feel welcome, not just buildings that look impressive." Noah's eyes softened immediately. "That is a wonderful goal." Lucas nodded before turning toward me. "And I want every project to have a place where people can sit down together. Maybe a little coffee corner. Maybe a reading space. Somewhere people slow down long enough to remember each other." I laughed quietly. "That sounds like someone I know." "Actually," Lucas admitted with a grin, "it sounds like both of you." A comfortable silence settled over us before Noah stood and wrapped one arm around our son's shoulders. "Whatever school you choose," he said gently, "I hope you never forget why you are building." Lucas smiled. "I will not." A few weeks later, the acceptance letter arrived. We celebrated after closing time with homemade pie from Mrs. Henderson, who insisted she had known since the day Lucas first carried a picture book into the cafe that he would someday do something meaningful. Officer Daniels stopped by just to congratulate him. Families who had watched him grow from a curious little boy into a thoughtful young man filled the cafe with applause that evening. Watching everyone gather around him, I realized something extraordinary had happened over the years. Lucas had not been raised only by Noah and me. In many ways, he had also been raised by an entire community that quietly celebrated every milestone together. As the evening grew quieter and the last guests headed home, Lucas remained standing near the front window where everything had first begun. He looked out at the sidewalk for a long moment before speaking. "Can I ask you both something?" "Always," Noah answered. Lucas smiled thoughtfully. "Do you think life would have been completely different if one cup of coffee had never been free?" Noah looked at me before softly laughing. "Probably." I nodded. "Almost certainly." Lucas leaned against the window frame, watching people stroll beneath the glowing streetlights. "That is amazing." "What is?" I asked. "That something so small could change so many lives." None of us spoke for a moment because there was nothing to add. The answer surrounded us. It lived in every familiar face that walked through our door, every child curled up with a favorite book in the reading corner, every conversation that lingered a little longer because no one felt rushed to leave. It lived in a family we had built without ever setting out to build one. Noah reached for my hand exactly as he had done so many times before. His smile was still the same one I had first noticed across the coffee counter years ago, only now it carried the quiet confidence of someone who no longer wondered where he belonged. Lucas switched off the lights in the reading corner before walking toward us with the easy contentment of someone who had never needed to question whether he was loved. Together we locked the front door, just as we had done countless evenings before, and stood for one last moment beneath the warm glow of the cafe sign. The sidewalk was calm. The air carried the familiar scent of roasted coffee drifting from inside, and somewhere in the distance someone laughed as they walked home. I smiled because I finally understood something that had taken years to learn. Happiness is rarely found in dramatic moments that change everything overnight. More often, it arrives quietly, disguised as kindness, patience, consistency, and the courage to care about another person without expecting anything in return. Long before we realized it, those ordinary choices had become the strongest foundation any family could ever hope to build. And every morning when I unlocked the cafe door, welcomed the first customer with a smile, and watched another day begin, I silently hoped that somewhere, someone else might discover what we had been lucky enough to find together. That the smallest gesture, offered with a genuine heart, can become the beginning of a lifetime, filled with love, belonging, and a place to call home.